The vast majority of people felt very positively about their experience of taking rapamycin. Decreased aging, improved health, improved happiness, improved brain health. I thought the results here were actually quite interesting. There was only one potential side effect, significantly greater in the rapamycin users compared to the non-users. My name is Matt Kaeberlein, and welcome to the Optispan YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 3 of the R Files. Today we're going to talk about a study we published middle of last year where we tried to gather data from as many people as we could who have been using rapamycin off-label. And what that means is rapamycin being prescribed by a physician for a purpose other than what it is FDA approved for. So the FDA approved indication is on label, and any FDA approved drug can be prescribed by a physician off label for other uses as long as the physician believes that that is in the best interest of the patient. So I would sort of describe off-label use of rapamycin as a combination of fact, fiction, and a whole lot of speculation. I really wish we had more data to draw strong conclusions, but I think we were actually able to learn some interesting information from this study of off-label use. So to start with, probably everyone listening to this video has heard of rapamycin before. You're probably aware that it was originally discovered on Easter Island, which of course is also goes by the name Rapa Nui. That's where rapamycin gets its name from. And it was actually isolated from a soil sample there. It's produced by a bacterium called Streptomyces hygroscopicus that is found in the soil on Easter Island and in various other places around the world. So it was actually identified in 1972 from a sample that had been collected, I guess, 8 years earlier, 1964, then became studied quite extensively for its potential antifungal, anti-cancer activities. It was actually originally FDA approved to prevent organ transplant rejection. And so that was the first on-label use of rapamycin was in organ transplant patients to prevent rejection of their organs. And again, just so people don't get confused, in the clinical world, rapamycin is referred to as sirolimus or sirolimus. It's exactly the same drug. They just have different names just to make life complicated. Since being approved for kidney transplants and for other organ transplants, it has also been approved for use in cardiac stents, and other mTOR inhibitors have been approved for a variety of types of cancers and a few other indications. So this is a well-known drug with quite a long history of clinical use. And I'll come back to that because that's important for a couple of reasons. As we talked about previously on the podcast and in episode 1, rapamycin is a specific inhibitor of a protein called mTOR. The protein is actually named after rapamycin. It's mTOR stands for mechanistic target of rapamycin. So the drug was actually used to identify the protein. And we know a lot about mTOR. It functions in 2 complexes, mTOR complex 1 and mTOR complex 2. And again, went into a fair amount of detail in this in episode 1 of the R Files, where I talked about how I first got interested in studying rapamycin from the research perspective. The reason why rapamycin is so interesting in the context of longevity and aging is that it really has been found to be the most robust and reproducible pharmacological or drug-based way to increase lifespan and healthspan metrics in laboratory animals. And one of the nice things about rapamycin is that it's not only the drug that has been shown to do this, it's also the genetic knockdown or knockout of mTOR. Again, pretty much in every laboratory model organism where this has been tested, both genetic inhibition of mTOR or pharmacological inhibition of mTOR with rapamycin has been shown to increase lifespan and broadly delay most, if not all, of the functional declines and molecular changes that go along with aging. So it really seems to target the biology of aging kind of fundamentally. And consistent with that, if you think about the hallmarks of aging, there are now 12 hallmarks of aging. There's evidence in the literature that rapamycin is impacting all of those hallmarks of aging. So again, it's not really only affecting cancer or only affecting mitochondrial dysfunction. It really seems to be broadly impacting the biology of aging. And don't think anybody, in the field who's knowledgeable about the literature would argue that really, second to caloric restriction, rapamycin is the most tested and most consistent intervention for increasing lifespan in mammals, in mice and rats in the laboratory. And in fact, I think you could make a case that when you start to look across genetic backgrounds, rapamycin might even be more consistent than caloric restriction. There are many genetic backgrounds, at least, where caloric restriction effects are smaller or caloric restriction can actually be harmful. That hasn't been seen yet in rapamycin. In the case of rapamycin, although I think it's certainly fair to say rapamycin hasn't been tested in quite as many genetic backgrounds as caloric restriction has. But nonetheless, rapamycin is really the most robust drug that we have for impacting the biology of aging, at least in laboratory studies. And so there's a lot of interest. A couple of things that I think are important to appreciate about rapamycin. First of all, it's not a miracle drug. So we're not talking about, increasing the lifespan of an animal by tenfold. The biggest effect that's been seen in laboratory animals with rapamycin, or at least mice, mammals with rapamycin, is about a 25% increase in lifespan. That's still, believe it or not, the most effective longevity drug that we know about, at least if you look at absolute effects on lifespan. And I think importantly, we know now that you can actually start the treatment with rapamycin in middle age, so about the mouse equivalent of a 60-year-old person biologically. And importantly, even transient treatments with rapamycin are enough to robustly increase lifespan and delay, or even in some case reverse, functional declines that go along with aging. So if you look in pretty much every tissue and organ where this has been studied, you can find evidence in a mammal, in a mouse or a rat, that rapamycin is at least delaying the declines that go along with aging. And in several cases now, you can actually find evidence for functional reversion upon treatment with rapamycin. So specifically in the heart, Peter Rabinovich's lab and a couple of others now have also shown that you can reverse age-related heart decline in a mouse in about 10 weeks. In the ovary, you can reverse age-related senescence of the ovary. And as I talked about in my interview with Jonathan Ahn, in the oral cavity in my lab, we showed that you can reverse periodontal disease in 8 weeks from rapamycin treatment. And then I think in one of the most interesting studies of rapamycin in the preclinical literature, in fact, we'll do a deeper dive maybe into this study in a future episode, Pan Zheng's lab at Michigan, way back in 2009, showed that you could actually reverse immune decline with age in only 6 weeks of treatment with rapamycin. And so again, across many different organs and tissues, we're seeing that rapamycin really seems to broadly delay and in some cases even reverse aspects of aging. So it's pretty exciting from that perspective. Now, obviously we have much more limited data in people, which was the whole rationale for the study that I'm going to tell you about today, at least in terms of the effects of rapamycin on, aging and age-related functional declines. It is worth saying that there have been a few fairly large clinical trials that were done by Joan Manick, first at Novartis and then at Restore Bio, looking at the effects of a derivative of rapamycin called everolimus, also goes by the name RAD001, showing that in healthy older people, 6 weeks of treatment with everolimus is enough to boost vaccine response and apparently also protect people over the next 6 to 9 months from other respiratory tract infections. So very, very, I think, consistent with the study from Pan Zheng's lab in mice, suggesting that, these transient treatments with rapamycin are sufficient to kind of rejuvenate the function of the immune system in the context of older people. So that's kind of the body of literature that we've got for best evidence that rapamycin could impact aging or age-related functional endpoints in people. But of course, there have been, hundreds, I'm sure now thousands or even tens of thousands of people who have been using rapamycin, what's called off-label, based on the idea that it might improve health span or might increase lifespan in humans. And if you want to check out episode 2 of the R Files, I talk a bit about my personal experience on the first time that I used rapamycin off-label. So there's a large group of people who've been using rapamycin off-label, and we thought that this would be a good opportunity to try to collect data and figure out, is there any evidence for benefits what do the side effects look like? So, given this kind of state of the situation, you might be wondering, why aren't more people taking rapamycin, given all the huge effects that are seen in mice? And it's complicated. I think probably the biggest barrier to sort of widespread comfort among the medical community with people using rapamycin off-label is that it really still has a bad reputation among most clinicians. And I believe that's largely because of the way rapamycin was developed as an immunosuppressant used in organ transplant patients. In that context, the drug is used at high doses in a patient population that is taking strong immunosuppressants, so multiple other drugs. And in that context, it is the case that rapamycin has a pretty long list of side effects. Now, I would argue, though, even in that context, the side effects are not terrible, but they're certainly unpleasant for many people, and concerning. And probably concerning enough that a physician would be hesitant to prescribe rapamycin to somebody that they consider healthy, on the chance that it might have an impact on aging or healthspan. Unfortunately, because rapamycin is off patent, despite the fact that the preclinical literature in laboratory animals suggests literally dozens of endpoints and diseases where rapamycin could be beneficial, there really is no incentive for pharmaceutical companies to invest the money necessary to do the large clinical trials to get FDA approval for those indications. And of course, there's no obvious path to regulatory approval for targeting aging. So that combination of bad reputation and lack of incentive to do the important clinical trials has sort of led to this situation where physicians are generally uncomfortable, many physicians are generally uncomfortable prescribing rapamycin off-label for their patients. And there has really been a dearth of new data to evaluate, what might the benefits be at lower doses in healthier people, and what do the side effects really look like. So that was the rationale for trying to collect this data. And one of the things that's important to appreciate is if you look at the label for rapamycin, it actually has a black box label from the FDA. There is this huge long list of side effects that have been seen in organ transplant patients. Now, again, it's not really clear to me how common these side effects are, how severe they are. There are many organ transplant patients who took mTOR inhibitors for many, many years. But nonetheless, I think it definitely is the case that there are real side effects seen in this patient population. So again, that contributes to the hesitancy of doctors to prescribe rapamycin off-label. So we decided we should try to see what the landscape really looked like. And so we designed a survey-based study to collect data from people who had used rapamycin off-label. We were fortunate to get a grant from the Impetus Grants Foundation, who I'm very grateful to. I think the Impetus Grants are an immensely important program in the field, and they funded a lot of these kinds of studies that be very difficult to get funded through traditional grant mechanisms like NIH. So we got a grant to do this work. We designed a survey with 10 modules. And again, the goal was really to collect information about health history, demographics, potential side effects, potential benefits from people who'd been using rapamycin off-label. Now, we wanted to have a comparison group. So we opened this up not only to people who had used rapamycin, but also to individuals who'd never used rapamycin. And so we were able to have that comparison. We ended up with 333 people in the rapamycin user group, and it was like 150 or so in the non-user group. And so the participants were invited to come to the website. They were recruited sort of broadly through a variety of approaches. We talked to physicians who had been prescribing rapamycin off-label, and they were able to contact their patients and tell them about the study. We used some groups on the internet, like the Rapamycin News website or the Facebook Rapamycin users group, to recruit people into the study. We used social media and word of mouth. Everybody who came to the website was required to complete an informed consent before they were given access to the survey. And then once they completed the informed consent, they were able to access the 10 modules. And the 10 modules didn't have to all be completed in one sitting, but you had to complete a module in order for that information to be saved, and you could come back if you wanted to. Only those people who completed all 10 modules were included in the final analysis. And again, there were 333 in the rapamycin user group, and we ended up with 172 who had never taken rapamycin. So that's the data set. Obviously, there's lots of limitations to this kind of a study and to this particular data set. So first of all of the data was patient reported, right, or participant reported. So we did not have clinical validation to the information that the participants provided to us. Obviously, no randomization or selection, at least not intentional selection. Obviously, there were some potential biases in the sample group. It was only people who heard about the study and who came to the website, who took the survey. So that's one potential source of bias. And as we learned, this is probably a group that is healthier than at least a typical cross-section of America. So it was enriched for biohackers and people who were very interested in their health. And I also think it's important to note that it's possible that the rapamycin user group was biased against people who tried taking the drug and for whatever reason weren't able to continue taking it. Maybe they had bad side effects or something else. So that's really hard to rule out in a study like this. So lots of caveats that limit the interpretation of this study, but nonetheless, I think as you'll see, we were able to get, I think, some pretty interesting information out of this group. So this is the table that shows the basic demographics of the rapamycin users and the rapamycin non-users. So obviously there were more men than women. Interestingly, the rapamycin users were 5 to 10 years older, but depending on whether you're a woman or a man, than the non-users. So if anything, we would have expected that the health conditions that we asked about would be more prevalent in the rapamycin group than in the non-users, just based on age. And you can see throughout the rest of the information, they're pretty comparable. But as I mentioned, not typical in terms of self-reported health or healthy lifestyle compared to the average American, right? So I don't think almost 90% of average Americans would report that they exercise regularly, for example. So again, it looks pretty equal between the two groups. Nothing concerning here that we're going to bias ourselves to favor rapamycin use, at least based on the information we were able to get about the different groups. Okay, so one thing I know a lot of people are interested in is like, what's the dose? What dose should I take, right? I hear that a lot. There is no answer to that question because we don't really know. But what I can tell you is that among the people who completed this survey, which I think is a pretty good representation of the off-label use of rapamycin out there, by far, the most common dose that people are taking is 6 milligrams once a week. But there's a lot of variation around both sides of that. Some people only taking 1 milligram once a week, some people all the way up to 20 milligrams once a week. There were, of course, also people in the group that were taking daily rapamycin as opposed to weekly rapamycin, but about 90% of the survey respondents were doing this sort of once weekly dosing. So you may be asking why? Why 6 milligrams and why once a week? And again, I think this is just sort of in some ways an accident of how off-label use of rapamycin evolved. So I mentioned the clinical trials from Joan Manick looking at immune function in healthy older people. I think part of the reason why the community has gravitated towards once weekly use is because in that study, they tested daily use, 5 milligrams once a week. So I think it's one milligram a day, 5 milligrams once a week, or 20 milligrams once a week. And what they found in terms of influenza vaccine response, the efficacy was greatest in the 5 milligrams once a week group, and the side effects in that group were no different than placebo. So I think that contributed to this idea that once weekly dosing might be superior, at least for healthspan uses, compared to daily dosing, which is what's done in the organ transplant community. I think the other reason is that some of the early adopters in terms of physicians who started prescribing rapamycin off-label, in particular, Dr. Alan Green, who was a co-author on this study, that was the dose that they sort of settled on, the 6 milligrams once a week as like their standard dose that they would prescribe for their patients. And so, many of the early adopters in the off-label use of rapamycin were using this 6 milligrams once a week, and I think that has certainly persisted to today. So regardless, that's the most common dose, but with people doing lots of different things around that. And of course, some people reported, they take grapefruit juice with their rapamycin every day. Grapefruit juice will increase the bioavailability of rapamycin. That's because grapefruit juice inhibits an enzyme called cytochrome P450, which is part of the pathway that metabolizes rapamycin in the body. So you inhibit that enzyme, you get higher levels of rapamycin that persist longer in the body. I'm, again, not recommending that anybody do that, but some people report taking grapefruit juice with their rapamycin, which, again, I just say that to illustrate the fact that this complicates the analysis of dose, because 6 milligrams in somebody taking grapefruit juice at the same time could potentially be very, very different in terms of bioavailability than 6 milligrams in somebody not drinking grapefruit juice at the same time. There's also a lot of inter-individual variability in uptake and pharmacokinetics of rapamycin. And so again, I really hesitate to draw too many conclusions from just the dose that somebody is taking. Okay, so what did we see? So one of the things that we asked about was just sort of, this was only among the rapamycin users for this particular module. So, one of the first modules was, have you ever used rapamycin? And if somebody said no, they would skip this module. So among the people who had taken rapamycin off-label, we just asked about a whole list of kind of self-reported, feelings, experiences from taking rapamycin. And by far, maybe not surprising, the vast majority of people felt very positively about their experience of taking rapamycin. So many people reported that they felt like they had decreased aging, improved health, improved happiness, improved brain health. And so, it's hard to, again, feel super confident about this kind of self-reported information, but it certainly is consistent with the idea, again, at least among this group, that the vast majority of people who used rapamycin off-label felt that they had benefited from it. Okay, so I think what we can draw a little bit more confidence from are the comparisons between the rapamycin users and the non-users. And so the way we approached this in this survey module was to ask about 44 different potential side effects, right? So things that you might expect would be side effects associated with using rapamycin. And the way the question was formatted was very simplistic. It was, in the last 3 months, have you experienced X? And again, we had a list of 44 different things. And in this particular comparison, because the recall time frame was 3 months, have you experienced this in the past 3 months, we limited this to the rapamycin users who'd been using rapamycin for at least the past 3 months, so 3 months or longer, and compared them to the non-users. And I thought the results here were actually quite interesting. There was only one potential side effect that was statistically significantly different, or greater, I should say, significantly greater in the rapamycin users compared to the non-users, and that was mouth sores. That's actually reassuring, because mouth sores is the most common side effect seen in organ transplant patients. It's probably anecdotally the most common side effect just reported by people using rapamycin off-label. And in our group, it was about 15% of the rapamycin users that reported mouth ulceration. And one interesting thing, and John now is doing a follow-up study looking at periodontal health in the people from this study, and asking the question, how severe are the mouth ulcers in off-label use? Because in the organ transplant patients, these can actually be quite severe. And actually, this is a common dose-limiting toxicity, meaning people stop taking the drug because the mouth sores are so severe. It's early, and this isn't published yet, but it seems like in the off-label users, we're really talking about mouth sores that are kind of more like a common canker sore. So not the very severe ulcers in the mouth that organ transplant patients get. Again, that kind of makes sense. But this does seem to be a real and fairly common, again, about 15% of people, side effect associated with off-label use of rapamycin. Interestingly, nothing else out of that list of 44 came out as significantly greater in the rapamycin users compared to the non-users. So that's pretty interesting. There was a trend that did not reach statistical significance for higher rates of infections, and bacterial infections in particular, in the rapamycin users. So if I had to point to one other side effect that might be real, it could be this slight uptick in risk of bacterial infections. And I really would like to see a larger data set to know whether or not that's real or not. But the other thing that I thought was super interesting was there were 6 other side effects that were less frequent, statistically significantly less frequent in the rapamycin users compared to the non-users. And it's a pretty interesting set of potential side effects. Included in there was depression, anxiety, and a variety of different types of pain: abdominal pain, muscle pain, eye pain. Those are interesting because there is a body of literature outside of longevity suggesting that rapamycin can have effects in these areas, in anxiety and in chronic depression, even things like autism. So I don't know if this is real or not, but I certainly think it's intriguing, plausible that it could be real and worthy of further study. And so I would like to see this be studied in much more detail. The pain part, I think, is particularly interesting. You could imagine age-related aches and pains. And, as I talked about in episode 2 of the R Files, my personal experience would fall in line with this. There's also some interesting data coming out of the psychiatry field in the combination of ketamine with rapamycin in patients with severe chronic pain or severe chronic depression. So again, potentially interesting intersect points that I don't think have been really explored in a rigorous way, but I think there's probably something real there that we just haven't quite figured out yet. So this, I think, is reassuring in one way. It definitely, to me, suggests that off-label use of rapamycin is very unlikely to have a high amount of side effects associated with it. I think this backs up what is the perception of most people who've been studying this community. And there may actually be some pretty significant benefits associated with off-label use of rapamycin. And in areas that we actually maybe weren't anticipating. So the other thing that we learned from this study that I think is intriguing and certainly worthy of follow-up study was the interaction between rapamycin and COVID-19 infection. And because, this study was being done in, late 2022, early 2023, this was just after the COVID-19 pandemic. And so many people who'd been using rapamycin off-label had experienced COVID-19 infection while they were taking rapamycin. And so we were able to ask the question, what impact, if any, did rapamycin have on risk of COVID-19 infection or severity of COVID-19 infection among the people who got infected? And so for this particular analysis, we split the rapamycin users up into 3 groups, because you could imagine there were people who were taking rapamycin at the time of their infection, and they then stopped taking rapamycin because they were worried about how it might impact the infection. There were people who were taking rapamycin at the time of their infection, but continued to take it throughout their infection. And there were several people in the rapamycin user group who had had a COVID-19 infection, but didn't start taking rapamycin or had never used rapamycin until after their COVID-19 infection. So we split the rapamycin users up into those 3 groups, and we compared them to people who had never used rapamycin. And so the first thing we noticed is that risk of infection was no different between the groups. So in other words, taking rapamycin, not taking rapamycin did not impact the likelihood that somebody was going to become infected with COVID-19. But what was interesting was when we then looked at the likelihood of a moderate or severe COVID-19 infection, and that was defined by the length of the persistence of symptoms and whether or not hospitalization was required. The interesting thing there was that when we compare the people who used rapamycin throughout their entire COVID-19 infection, they were statistically significantly less likely to experience a moderate or severe COVID-19 infection compared to people who never used rapamycin, but also compared to people who stopped taking rapamycin. So that's suggestive and I think really interesting. And, I doubt that we will get a clinical trial to determine whether or not that is a reproducible result. But it is intriguing, especially given, data from Joan, Manick, and other people that rapamycin treatment or a derivative of rapamycin can boost antiviral gene expression. So you might that might be a plausible explanation for why the severity of the infection appeared to be reduced in people who took rapamycin throughout their infection. The other thing that was interesting about the COVID-19 data was that when we looked at symptoms consistent with long COVID, there was a significant reduction in long COVID symptoms when we compare the people who had taken rapamycin continuously compared to the people who had never taken rapamycin. Our data, I don't think, was large enough. We didn't have a high enough N to be able to do the comparison with the other groups among the rapamycin users. But at least comparing continuous use to non-users, there was a statistically significant reduction in likelihood of symptoms consistent with long COVID. And I would love to see a clinical trial of rapamycin in people suffering from long COVID. I actually think there's a really good chance that rapamycin could be beneficial for many of those people. And hopefully we'll get that information someday. So in conclusion, I think what I would leave you with is, first of all, rapamycin clearly in the scientific preclinical literature is the gold standard for longevity and health span promoting intervention. In people, we don't know yet whether rapamycin is going to have significant longevity benefits, significant health span benefits, but I think we can start now to conclude that the risk from low dose rapamycin use or weekly rapamycin use in people of normal health status, so not organ transplant patients, not cancer patients, appears to be pretty small. At least many people can take rapamycin off-label for a relatively long period of time and suffer no apparent ill consequences at all. The majority of people in our study who used rapamycin off-label, at least self-reported positive health impacts. That was backed up by a statistical comparison of potential side effects. Again, there were 7 things that were different statistically between rapamycin users and non-users. The only one that was worse in the rapamycin users was mouth sores. 6 other things were better in the rapamycin users. And there's some evidence to think that rapamycin use could have some benefits in the context of COVID-19, either reducing the likelihood of severity of an acute infection, but I think more importantly, potentially having some benefits on symptoms associated with long COVID. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is nowhere near the standards of a placebo-controlled, double-blind, randomized clinical trial. There are some caveats, a lot of caveats associated with this kind of self-reported survey-based data. But I think given where we're at, and given that the definitive clinical trials in the near future are unlikely, there's actually a lot of value to this study. And I would also suggest this is a template for potentially other studies of this type for off-label use of rapamycin or other medications or even supplements within the longevity sort of biohacker community. And I'm hopeful that in the future we'll see more of those kinds of studies. So I hope that this has been informative and you've learned something interesting, useful, fun. I don't know. Hope you've had a good time. I sure have. And thank you for joining me on this episode of the R Files, and I hope to see you next time.